It is the morning of April 18th, 1943. Hundreds of miles apart, two parallel flights take to the air. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto leaves Rabaul in a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, surrounded by fighter escorts on a strict, seemingly secure timetable. Simultaneously, 16 American P-38 Lightnings are flying low over the ocean, attempting a pure mathematical intercept. If their calculation is off by a few minutes or a handful of miles, they will find only empty sky. Two blind groups are moving across thousands of square miles of ocean toward a single invisible dot. How do you perfectly intercept one specific man when he has no idea he is being hunted? This is the story of Operation Vengeance, the longest-range fighter interception of the Second World War. It is not a tale of a chance encounter or a roaming patrol getting lucky. It is the story of how an impossible mathematical equation was deliberately solved in the sky. In modern warfare, intercepting a high-value target relies on a constant stream of real-time data. Satellite surveillance, data links, and ground-controlled radar guiding pilots directly to their prey. In 1943, none of that existed. Over the sprawling, featureless expanse of the South Pacific, pilots operated in a profound fog of war. Finding a single enemy formation hundreds of miles behind hostile lines meant navigating a vast, empty ocean using nothing but a magnetic compass, an airspeed indicator, and a wristwatch. The central problem of this mission was terrifyingly simple. American codebreakers had pulled a few lines of decrypted radio traffic out of the ether. But translating ink on a page into a physical collision between two groups of aircraft in a fleeting 3-minute window of time required bridging a massive gap between intelligence and execution. If the winds shifted, if the navigation was off by a single degree, or if the enemy simply changed his mind, those decrypted lines meant nothing. The Pacific Ocean would swallow the attempt without a trace. To turn intelligence into an actual strike required more than just knowing who the target was and roughly where he was going. It demanded an environment where variables were eliminated. And paradoxically, the entire American operation, every drop of fuel calculated and every bearing plotted, would only become possible because the Japanese military apparatus and the specific man they were hunting valued one distinct trait above all else: absolute, predictable punctuality. The demand for absolute punctuality was not merely a personality quirk. It was the institutional bedrock of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And in the spring of 1943, that institution desperately needed order. The Pacific War had reached a brutal pivot point. The Guadalcanal campaign had just concluded in a grinding, catastrophic defeat for the Japanese Empire. For 6 agonizing months, the meat grinder of the Solomon Islands had chewed up Japan's most experienced aviators, its elite infantry, and its irreplaceable destroyers. The strategic momentum had violently shifted to the Americans. In response, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, launched Operation IGO, a massive, desperate air offensive designed to smash Allied shipping and buy Japan time to reinforce its defensive perimeter. By mid-April, the air offensive was winding down. The Japanese pilots had fought fiercely, but the psychological toll on the frontline forces at the edge of the empire was staggering. Recognizing the exhaustion of his men, Yamamoto decided to intervene personally. He was not just a senior officer issuing orders from a distant flagship. He was the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, the brilliant strategic mind driving Japan's naval war, and a figure of immense, almost mythical cultural gravity. To the sailors and pilots of the combined fleet, Yamamoto was the irreplaceable soul of the Navy. He understood that his men needed to see him. He planned a rapid, aggressive inspection tour of the forward aviation bases in the Upper Solomon Islands, specifically targeting the austere airfields on Bougainville and the Shortland Islands. He wanted to look his battered pilots in the eye, inspect their logistics, and project strength on the very edge of the American advance. However, Moving a commander of Yamamoto's towering stature through an active, contested combat zone is a massive logistical undertaking. You do not simply put the commander-in-chief in a medium bomber and fly him blindly into hostile airspace. Forward airfields must be prepped. Local commanders need to assemble their troops and officers for formal inspection. Most importantly, fighter squadrons must be precisely positioned, fueled, and launched to provide an impenetrable escort. To guarantee this absolute security, Yamamoto's staff at the 8th Fleet headquarters in Rabaul meticulously planned every single minute of the upcoming trip. They drafted a comprehensive itinerary that left zero room for ambiguity or individual interpretation. On the evening of April 13, 1943, Japanese communications officers transmitted this schedule to the base commanders at Bougainville and the surrounding island garrisons. The message was encoded in JN-25D, the Imperial Japanese Navy's primary operational cipher. The Japanese High Command fundamentally believed that JN-25 was an unbreakable system. It relied on a massive codebook of 5-digit numbers, which was then scrambled by a secondary book of random additive numbers. Because it was considered a mathematically impenetrable fortress of encryption, the Japanese staff did not mask or disguise the details of the Admiral's movements. The transmission plainly stated that on the morning of April 18th, the Commander-in-Chief would depart Rabaul in a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, escorted by a protective flight of 6 Zero fighters. It listed his exact departure time of 0600. It dictated the precise altitudes he would fly, the compass headings his pilots would follow, and the exact minute his aircraft was scheduled to touch down at the Balalai airfield. It was a masterclass in meticulous military staff work, thorough, highly organized, and designed to wrap the Admiral in a flawless, predictable blanket of security. But the Japanese were completely unaware that the walls of their cryptographic fortress had already been breached. Thousands of miles away, in the damp, subterranean basement of Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, and at listening posts scattered from Australia to Alaska, American signals intelligence was quietly vacuuming up the Pacific's radio traffic. The American codebreakers had been steadily, obsessively chipping away at the JN-25 cipher for over a year. They couldn't read every message, and they couldn't read them instantly, but they were deep inside the system. They had cracked enough of the additive tables to read the underlying code. When the Japanese broadcast the April 13th itinerary, American monitoring stations intercepted the signal and immediately routed it to the cryptanalysts. Within hours, a Marine Corps major named Alva Laswell, sitting in that basement in Hawaii, decrypted the text and translated the Japanese characters. As the words formed on the page, the sheer magnitude of the document became shockingly clear. This was not a routine logistical manifest. It was not a vague, heavily coded summary of distant fleet movements. It was the personal, minute-by-minute travel diary of the most important man in the Imperial Japanese military. In the shadowy, agonizingly slow world of signals intelligence, where analysts usually scrape together fragmented clues to guess at enemy intentions, this was an unprecedented lightning strike. It was the ultimate intelligence jackpot, handed to them on a silver platter. The narrative of this interception reveals a devastating operational paradox. The Japanese staff had transmitted this highly detailed schedule exclusively to protect Yamamoto. They wanted to ensure that local anti-aircraft batteries knew a friendly flight was coming, and that fighter escorts were waiting at the precise coordinates in the sky to shield him from American patrols. Yet, by demanding such rigid, uncompromising coordination, they had mapped out his exact execution. This vulnerability was exponentially magnified by Yamamoto's own reputation. The American intelligence officers knew that the Admiral was famous for his strict, almost religious adherence to schedules. He was a man who valued punctuality as a core tenet of his command style. Therefore, the Americans knew this intercepted itinerary was not merely a rough estimate or a suggested flight plan. It was an ironclad promise. If the decrypted paper said the Admiral's bomber would be over the southern coast of Bougainville at exactly 0935, his aircraft would be there at 0935. Not 0930, not 0940. The exactness of the schedule, engineered entirely to guarantee his safety, had instantly become the very condition that made his interception mathematically possible. The Japanese desire for order had manufactured a fatal vulnerability. By the morning of April 14th, the translated message was sitting on the desks of the highest-ranking American commanders in the Pacific. They had been handed a miraculous, almost impossible advantage. They knew exactly where the architect of the Japanese war machine would be, down to the minute, 4 days before he even stepped onto the tarmac. But possessing a decrypted schedule is not the same thing as possessing the capability to strike. Knowing the target's location in the vastness of the Pacific was a monumental intelligence breakthrough. But taking that piece of paper and deciding to actually use it presented a terrifying strategic nightmare. That piece of paper immediately triggered one of the most high-stakes command decisions of the Pacific War. The American leadership was suddenly holding a live grenade. The opportunity to eliminate Admiral Yamamoto was a massive tactical prize, but acting on it carried a terrifying strategic risk. If American fighters suddenly appeared hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, exactly at the minute the commander-in-chief was passing by, the Japanese would inevitably ask how they knew. The most logical conclusion would be that the JN-25 cipher was broken. If the Japanese realized their primary operational code was compromised, they would instantly change their entire cryptographic system. America would go completely blind in the Pacific. The intelligence network that had just helped secure victory at Midway and Guadalcanal would be erased overnight. The debate reached all the way to Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox and Admiral Chester Nimitz. They had to weigh the immediate value of killing a brilliant strategist against the long-term value of reading the enemy's mail. It was a massive intelligence gamble, but the chance to remove the most experienced and respected figure in the Imperial Japanese Navy, a commander whose loss might permanently fracture Japanese morale, was too significant to pass up. The decision was made. The strike was authorized. The intelligence officers had done their job. Now they handed the burden to the engineers and the pilots on Guadalcanal. Immediately, a massive physical barrier slammed into the planning process. The intercepted route showed Yamamoto flying from Rabaul to Bougainville. The closest American airstrip was Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. A straight line drawn between Guadalcanal and the interception point over Bougainville measured over 300 miles. Standard fighter aircraft of 1943 simply could not make that trip. A typical fighter like the F-4F Wildcat or the F-4U Corsair did not have the fuel capacity to fly 300 miles into hostile territory, engage in a high-throttle dogfight, and then fly 300 miles back. But the Americans had one specific asset that could force the math to work: the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The P-38 was a massive twin-engine fighter, but even its impressive internal fuel tanks were not enough for a 600-mile round trip, especially since the pilots couldn't fly a direct line. If they flew straight from Guadalcanal to Bougainville, they would be spotted by a chain of Japanese radar stations and island observers along the Solomons, instantly ruining the element of surprise. They had to take a massive detour, swinging far out over the open ocean in a wide, curving path to bypass the enemy sensors before hooking back toward the interception point. This pushed the required flight distance beyond 400 miles each way. To make this impossible distance achievable, the ground crews at Henderson Field frantically stripped the fighters of excess weight and fitted them with oversized experimental external drop tanks. These massive metal pods, slung under the wings, doubled the aircraft's fuel capacity. The P-38s would essentially be flying fuel tankers, relying entirely on the external gas to reach Bougainville, dropping the empty tanks the moment they spotted the target and fighting on their internal reserves. Intelligence had isolated the target. Command had taken the gamble. Engineering had provided the range. The debate and the preparation were over. The entire weight of Operation Vengeance now compressed into a brutal, unforgiving mathematical equation that 16 men would have to solve in the sky. The entire burden of executing that mathematical equation fell on Major John Mitchell, the commander of the 339th Fighter Squadron. Sitting in the sweltering heat of Guadalcanal, Mitchell unrolled a navigational chart and stared at a massive expanse of blue. He knew the speed of the Japanese Mitsubishi G4M bomber, the Betty, cruising comfortably at roughly 200 miles per hour. He knew Yamamoto's exact departure time from Rabaul, 0600, and he knew the exact time the Admiral was scheduled to land at Balalai, 0945. With these variables, Mitchell essentially drew a timeline across the map. He calculated that at exactly 0935, Yamamoto's flight would be descending over the jungle canopy near Empress Augusta Bay on the southern coast of Bougainville. That specific coordinate, at that exact minute, was the only place this operation could succeed. To reach it, Mitchell plotted a massive dogleg route out over the Coral Sea. The flight path was completely devoid of landmarks. There were no islands to use as waypoints, no radio beacons to guide them, and no ground control radar to correct their course. The calculation had to be absolutely flawless. If Mitchell's pilots flew even 1 degree off course over a 400-mile distance, they would miss the intercept point by miles. If they flew slightly too fast, they would arrive early, burn precious fuel circling, and likely be spotted by Japanese observers on the coast. If they flew slightly too slow, they would arrive late, and the commander-in-chief would already be safely on the ground. They had to fly a convoluted, multi-leg route over the open ocean, managing their airspeed precisely to arrive at an invisible point in space at a specific minute. At 0710, on the morning of April 18th, the P-38 Lightnings roared down the dirt runway at Henderson Field. They were monstrously heavy, overloaded with fuel and ammunition, struggling to gain altitude in the dense tropical air. 16 fighters managed to form up. Mitchell divided them into 2 distinct groups. 14 P-38s would act as the high-altitude cover element, designed to climb rapidly and engage the escorting Japanese Zero fighters. The remaining 4, flown by Captain Thomas Lanphier, Lieutenant Rex Barber, Lieutenant Besby Holmes, and Lieutenant Ray Hine, were designated as the attack flight. Their sole objective was to ignore the Zeros, dive on the bombers, and kill the target. 2 pilots had aborted due to mechanical issues, leaving exactly 16 aircraft to execute the plan. Immediately after takeoff, the entire formation dropped down to the deck. To evade the Japanese radar stations scattered along the Solomon Islands, they had to stay under the radar horizon. For 2.5 hours, 16 massive twin-engine fighters flew less than 50 feet above the Pacific Ocean. The conditions inside the cockpits were grueling. The tropical sun beat down on the plexiglass canopies, turning them into greenhouse ovens. The pilots were sweating profusely, their hands cramped on the control yokes. They were flying in absolute, uncompromising radio silence. A single transmission, even an accidental click of a microphone, could be picked up by a Japanese listening post and ruin the entire operation. Every pilot's eyes flicked constantly between the endless rolling waves just below their propellers and the instrument panel. They watched their airspeed indicators and magnetic compasses with agonizing focus. Mitchell, leading the formation, was navigating purely by dead reckoning. He held a specific compass heading for a predetermined amount of time, turned to a new heading, and held that, hoping his calculations of wind drift and speed were correct. The psychological pressure was immense. They were flying blind into hostile territory, burning fuel at an alarming rate, entirely reliant on a mathematical theory drawn on a piece of paper the night before. While the Americans skimmed the waves in tense, silent concentration, the situation on the Japanese side was a study in relaxed, disciplined routine. Promptly at 0600, exactly as the decrypted itinerary had promised, Admiral Yamamoto boarded a Betty bomber at Rabaul. He was dressed impeccably in his pristine white summer uniform, carrying his ceremonial katana. A second Betty bomber carried his chief of staff, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, and other senior officers. They lifted off smoothly, joined by a protective escort of 6 Zero fighters. For the Japanese, this was a protected, high-level administrative flight. The weather was beautiful, the visibility was excellent, and the formation settled into a comfortable cruising altitude of roughly 6,500 feet. The pilots held their course with absolute precision. Yamamoto, sitting in the forward right seat of the lead bomber, peered out the window at the brilliant blue ocean and the lush green islands slipping past. The flight was progressing perfectly, according to the meticulously drafted schedule. The Japanese staff at Rabaul had engineered this punctuality to ensure that the fighter escorts and the anti-aircraft batteries at Bougainville knew exactly when to expect the commander-in-chief. They were executing their orders flawlessly. But in doing so, they were unwittingly fulfilling their half of the American equation. The strict adherence to the timetable, the very discipline that defined Yamamoto's command, was slowly, relentlessly pulling his aircraft directly into the crosshairs of the intercept point. The two formations were separated by hundreds of miles of empty sky, completely unaware of each other's physical presence. Yet they were locked onto a converging trajectory, driven entirely by the information contained in a single intercepted radio message. The distance between them shrank with every passing minute. Back in the American formation, the tension was reaching a breaking point. Mitchell checked his watch. It was 09:33. They had been flying inches above the ocean for over 2 hours. According to his dead reckoning calculations, they were approaching the final turn point. He signaled his pilots to begin a steep, rapid climb. The 16 P-38s pulled up sharply, their massive engines roaring as they clawed for altitude, finally breaking their low-level concealment. As they crested the climb, the southern coastline of Bougainville materialized in the distance, a dark green mass of jungle rising out of the water. The navigators had done the impossible. The Americans had arrived at the exact intercept coordinates. Mitchell checked his watch again. It was 09:34. The timing was perfect. But as the 16 American pilots desperately scanned the immense, glaring expanse of the Pacific sky, their hearts sank. The sky was completely, agonizingly empty. There were no bombers. There were no Zeros. There were no silhouettes on the horizon. The entire operation, the massive logistical gamble, the 2.5 hours of grueling low-level flying seemed to have culminated in a devastating, hollow failure. For a few agonizing seconds, the crushing reality set in. Perhaps the Japanese had changed the schedule. Perhaps the intelligence was wrong. Perhaps the wind had delayed the target. The mathematical equation had failed. For exactly 1 minute, the 16 American pilots stared into an agonizing void. Major Mitchell gripped his controls, wrestling with the sickening realization that a 400-mile gamble had ended in empty air. The silence over the radio was absolute, heavy with impending failure. Then, at 09:34 and 30 seconds, the voice of Lieutenant Doug Canning shattered the 2.5-hour radio silence. "Bogies, 11 o'clock high." Mitchell snapped his head up. There, descending perfectly toward Empress Augusta Bay, were faint, dark smudges against the glare of the morning sun. Within seconds, the smudges resolved into distinct, unmistakable silhouettes. 6 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters flying in a protective V formation, and tucked neatly beneath them, exactly where the decrypted schedule dictated, were the heavy, cigar-shaped profiles of Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers. The math had not failed. It had worked with terrifying perfection. Yamamoto was here. But the moment the American pilots visually acquired the target, a brutal new variable violently rewrote the equation. There was not one bomber, there were 2. The intelligence from Station Hypo had translated the itinerary, but the intercepted lines had never specified a decoy or a staff aircraft. Yamamoto was inside one of those bombers, and his chief of staff, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, was in the other. From miles away, closing at hundreds of feet per second, there was absolutely no way to determine which green fuselage carried the commander-in-chief. The meticulously planned assassination had instantly become a high-speed coin toss. There was no time to observe or evaluate. The silent 400-mile stalk shattered into the deafening roar of a chaotic, high-altitude ambush. Mitchell shoved his throttles forward, leading the 14 P-38s of the cover element into a brutal, screaming climb. Their job was to drag the Japanese fighter screen away, intentionally exposing themselves to the 6 escorting Zeros to tear open a hole in the defensive umbrella. Below them, the 4 lightnings of the attack element reached for their release levers. With heavy metallic thuds, their massive external drop tanks tumbled away into the ocean. Freed of the dead weight, the P-38s rolled over and plunged directly toward the bombers. In the cockpits of the Japanese aircraft, the comfortable illusion of an administrative tour vanished in a fraction of a second. The escorting Zero pilots desperately banked to intercept the plunging lightnings, realizing too late that they had been ambushed inside what they thought was completely secure airspace. The orderly Japanese formation immediately disintegrated. The pilots of the 2 Betty bombers did exactly what medium bombers do when caught by enemy fighters. They shoved their yokes forward. Engines screaming at maximum manifold pressure, the 2 heavy aircraft broke apart and dove aggressively for the deck. The silent mathematical problem was over. It was now a violent, desperate chase just feet above the dense, unforgiving canopy of the Bougainville jungle. The 2 Japanese bombers split, plunging toward the earth in a desperate bid for survival. One bomber banks sharply toward the ocean, attempting to skim the waves and run for safety. The other dives straight down toward the dense, unbroken canopy of the Bougainville jungle. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber of the American attack element shoved their P-38s into a steep, roaring pursuit. They ignore the dogfight erupting in the sky above them, locking their eyes entirely on the bomber diving toward the trees. They do not know if they are chasing the commander-in-chief or a decoy filled with staff officers. They only know that this aircraft must not escape. The heavy Mitsubishi bomber levels out terrifyingly close to the ground, its propellers tearing through the topmost branches of the jungle canopy. The Japanese pilot throws the heavy aircraft into violent evasive maneuvers, skidding low over the treetops to deny the Americans a clean firing angle. Barber pushes his throttles to the firewall, feeling the massive twin engines of his Lightning surge. He closes the distance with terrifying speed, diving right into the slipstream of the fleeing bomber. At less than 100 yards, the Japanese tail gunner opens fire. the muzzle flashes of his 20mm cannon stuttering against the glare of the jungle. Barber doesn't flinch. He aligns his heavy gun sight and squeezes the trigger. The nose of the P-38 erupts as four 50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon unleash a devastating, concentrated stream of armor-piercing rounds. The heavy American fire rips into the right engine of the Betty bomber. Thick black smoke instantly billows from the cowling. The bomber shudders violently, but the Japanese pilot fights the controls, desperately trying to keep the crippled aircraft in the air. Lanfear banks hard, cutting across the bomber's trajectory and firing a long, sustained burst into its left side. The concentrated firepower shreds the fuselage and tears into the left wing. The damage is catastrophic and irreversible. The heavy bomber violently snaps to the left, its wing violently catching the top of the jungle canopy. In a fraction of a second, the aircraft cartwheels into the dense, green foliage. A massive column of oily black smoke and a dull orange flash erupt from the trees, marking the exact point of impact. There is no time to circle. There is no time to take photographs or search for survivors. The sky above them is swarming with furious Japanese Zero pilots who have just watched the VIP flight they were sworn to protect be blown out of the sky. The American pilots slam their throttles forward, violently wrenching their P-38s away from the crash site. They have pushed their aircraft to the absolute limit. Their fuel gauges are dropping rapidly, and they are hundreds of miles deep inside hostile territory. The agonizing 2.5-hour flight out must now be repeated in reverse. But this time, the element of surprise is gone, and the entire Japanese military apparatus in the Solomon Islands is on full alert. They form up low over the water, leaving the burning wreckage in the jungle behind them. They have executed the impossible interception. They have shot down a Japanese bomber exactly on schedule. But as they begin the grueling, dangerous flight back to Guadalcanal, the adrenaline is rapidly replaced by a gnawing, agonizing question. They had seen the aircraft burn. They had seen it crash. But they had absolutely no way of knowing if the man inside that burning fuselage was actually Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The answer to their agonizing question lay smoking in the dense undergrowth of Bougainville. The following day, a Japanese search and rescue party hacked their way through the oppressive jungle canopy. When they finally reached the smoldering wreckage of the Mitsubishi bomber, they found what the American pilots could not confirm. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and the irreplaceable soul of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was dead. For the Japanese leadership in Tokyo, the confirmation was a catastrophic psychological blow. It arrived at the exact moment the empire was already bleeding out its strategic initiative in the Pacific. They had not just lost a senior commander, they had lost the one man who commanded the absolute reverence of the entire fleet. The Japanese military apparatus reeled from the shock, delaying the public announcement for over a month to cushion the devastating impact on national morale. But for the Americans, the aftermath of this massive tactical victory immediately morphed into an exercise in strict, uncompromising deception. The intelligence officers sitting in the basement of Station Hypo knew they had just pulled off the impossible. Yet they could not celebrate, and they certainly could not take credit. The American High Command faced a terrifying conflict. If they openly bragged about a perfectly timed interception, the Japanese would instantly realize their operational codes were completely transparent. To protect the secret of the broken cipher, the United States launched a massive disinformation campaign. They fabricated plausible cover stories, leaking rumors that civilian coast watchers in the Solomon Islands had spotted the admiral boarding his aircraft, or that the P-38 pilots had simply stumbled upon the bomber formation by sheer, incredible luck. The victory had to be disguised as an accident to ensure that the Japanese would continue broadcasting their most guarded secrets into the ether. This massive intelligence cover-up framed the ultimate, devastating irony of Operation Vengeance. Admiral Yamamoto did not die because American fighters randomly hunted him down in the vastness of the Pacific. He died because his own highly efficient, disciplined military apparatus essentially scheduled an appointment for his assassination. The Imperial Japanese Navy demanded uncompromising order. They required meticulously detailed itineraries, transmitted exact coordinates, and insisted on absolute punctuality to protect their most valuable commander. By treating a combat zone like a rigidly managed train schedule, they handed their enemy the exact time and place of the target. The greatest vulnerability in the Pacific War was not a lack of armor or weapons, but the fatal predictability of absolute discipline. Japan believed Yamamoto's itinerary was a perfectly guarded secret. America knew the route. America knew the time. And 16 P-38s were already on the way. Yamamoto thought he was flying to an inspection. The Americans were flying to an appointment.